All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Ask the SCSA. My name is Steve. I'm one of the safety advisors with the SCSA, and joining me today are my fellow teammates, Laura, Kieran, and Kara. And I'll let them introduce themselves.
Well, I'm Laura Lodge. I am a safety advisor out of the Regina office, and I've been with the SCSA since 2014.
Hi, I'm Kara Bilfell, Saskatoon Safety Advisor, and I've been with the SCSA for almost 2 years. I handle the Melfort and Nipawin-Tisdale region.
Afternoon, everyone. I'm Kieran Greening out of the Saskatoon office as well. I've been with the SCSA about 1.5 years now, and I deal with a few different regions, PA, east and west of Saskatoon, and then the greater Saskatoon area.
All right, thanks, guys. And I guess I should mention my area is kind of the south of the #1 right now. I'm actually out in my region as we speak, out in the RM of Wood River. So happy to be out here doing it from here. Today's presentation, Laura is going to be continuing with the audit tool, sections 11 to 13. If you haven't seen the ones to build up to this one, go to our YouTube and Facebook pages. A couple quick reminders before we do get started on that. If you're watching on with us on Zoom here, your questions, put them in the Q&A, not the chat. We'll definitely be able to answer them better from there. If you are watching through Facebook, we do have somebody monitoring through there. So your questions will be forwarded. So don't be afraid to put questions in, and we'll get to those ones as well. These sessions are being recorded, so this one and all previous ones are available on YouTube and our Facebook websites. The links can go right through scsaonline.ca. That's about it. So without further ado, Laura's going to continue with our audit book here.
Thanks so much, Steve. Okay, so share my screen and hopefully this pops up. Not in the heads? Okay, cool. Okay, guys, so we're going to jump into sections 11 to 13. So we have one more presentation after this week to cover the entire audit tool process. And so the goal here is just to help clarify what exactly the audit tool is asking for in these sections and what criteria needs to be met in order to meet the core standard. So sections covered this week, section 11 is emergency preparedness. So this includes equipment, training, and industry standards. Section 12 is the records and statistics area. So this section pertains to your program documentation and injury frequency and severity, as well as corrective actions for those things. And then section 13 is legislation. So this is a very brief section, and it's just meant to go over your program and make sure that it meets certain legislated criteria. So we'll sort of jump right into emergency preparedness, because this is a very big section of the audit tool. There's 10 questions in this section for a total of 27 possible points. So the first question asks, are the emergency preparedness plans appropriate to work activities? So the auditor is going to be looking at the work the company does and what potential emergencies could arise during the course of that work. Companies should have plans for any emergency that could potentially happen. And employers should be developing emergency preparedness plans based on things like the scope of work that they're doing, the number of personnel that they have on their site, as well as the physical location of the workplace itself. (11.2) asks, does the plan include a requirement for training in emergency procedures, roles, and responsibilities? So the emergency plan must have detailed information about who's responsible for what in an emergency. You have to have specific roles and responsibilities for the workers, for the supervisors, for any subcontractors that you have on site as well, and of course any emergency coordinators that you have organizing the group. So as well, employers must provide training to all workers in the emergency response plans, and as well during the interview phase, workers must be aware of their specific role during an emergency. whether they're leading it or whether their job is to just get out of the building or off site. They need to know exactly what that role is. So 11.3 asks, has that emergency response plan been tested for deficiencies and corrective actions taken? So during an emergency, you don't want to try and have to figure out what to do in order to respond expediently. You need to plan, prepare, and practice those drills well in advance. So we commonly see emergency plans and drills for things like fire or site evacuation. We see drills for intruders or active shooters. As well, we see drills for earthquakes or other natural disasters. And as we know is pretty common in Saskatchewan and in the prairie provinces, we've had 2 in the last week, I believe, just in Saskatchewan, tornadoes or other extreme weather. So plow winds, hail, those sorts of things employers need to be planning for. With those emergency plans, they must be tested at least annually. So at least once a year, you should be running through them, making sure that everything goes well, that people get out of the building in time. And you want to document the results of those drills, what happened, as well as corrective actions if you find that something needs to be changed in order for it to take place as quickly as possible. So the next question asks, does the employer have a written fire response plan? So the core audit tool specifically indicates that employers must have an emergency plan for dealing with fire. This is because things like tornadoes, tsunamis, intruders, or earthquakes may not necessarily apply to you or your situation. But planning for a fire emergency is almost always applicable. So whether the fire is going to start in tools, materials, from explosions or chemicals, or otherwise. So you want to have plans, including inspection and maintenance for firefighting equipment, including extinguishers, hoses, suppression systems. And as well, you need to have a written building or site evacuation plan posted in conspicuous locations in any site, shop, or office location that your company has. So the auditor will be looking for this site plan and your fire safety plans. So 11.5 goes on to ask, are the correct class and size of extinguishers available, marked, and visible? So this is an observation only question. To confirm this section, the auditor will look through your work sites, go through the offices and the shops to see if extinguishers are available in the correct class, size, and location according to what the legislation says, as well as what your company policy says you're going to do. Different types of fire require different fire suppression systems. So you have to ensure that the extinguishers that are near fire hazards are capable of putting that fire out depending on the fuel. And as well, auditors will be looking to ensure that there's sufficient signage and access to extinguishers in case of an emergency. People need to be able to find where they are and access them. So 11.6 expands on the fire situation and asks, are extinguishers regularly inspected and maintained? So to meet the standards of this question, the auditor will look at the types and the brands of extinguishers that you're using, and they're going to compare that to what your policy says you're going to do and what documentation actually shows that you've been doing. So fire suppression systems must show that extinguishers are serviced according to the manufacturer. So whatever they say needs to happen should be happening, and we need to have documentation to show that. And as well, during the observational tour, the auditor should find filled tags on each extinguisher that indicates that they've been serviced and are ready for use. So 11.7 asks, is the appropriate emergency communication system available? So during a core audit, the auditor will observe the work being performed, and they judge based on the site location, logistics, and other variables, whether the communication system that they have would be sufficient in the event of an actual emergency. So the auditor might assess hazards like, what if we needed to initiate a site or building evacuation? What if there was a fire and we needed to notify others? What if there was a medical emergency and somebody needed an ambulance? What if somebody needed to be rescued from a difficult to access area? Or what if somebody was working alone in a remote area? So the warning or emergency communication system for any one of these issues can be any number of things, from sirens to workers having being required to have personal phones on them, or even just two-way radios, depending on the size of the site. As long as in the event of an emergency, workers can initiate emergency response as quickly and efficiently as possible. So 11.8 asks, are there adequate first aid supplies and facilities? So during the observational tour of the work site, offices and shops, the auditor will observe the first aid supplies that are available and the facilities, and they're going to compare that with the legislative requirements that are found in tables 9, 10, 11, and 12. They are going to observe the contents of your first aid kits, make sure that they have all the required items that are listed in those tables, that those items are not expired, that the eye wash stations are available if necessary, that those stations are clean and as well not expired. As well, if your site requires blankets, stretchers, or splints to be available, that they are available and clean and ready to use. As well, the auditor will also look at the competency of first aid attendants. So what sort of training do they have? Does it meet the minimum standard? Again, in tables 9, 10, 11, and 12. And the last thing they're going to look at is the actual facility or location where first aid is going to be taking place. Is it clean? Is it organized, well lit? Is it ventilated and in an obvious location? Uh, 11.9 asks, are the required number of qualified first aid personnel on site? So firstly, to meet this requirement, you must have all the names of your attendants either posted or readily available for workers to find if necessary. The number of attendants you have can be based on anything such as your size, the size of your site, the type of your site, or the location of your work site. The bigger the site, the more difficult to access, the further away from a hospital or a medical facility is, may require you to have more attendants or more equipment available. And finally, during the interview phase of the audit, workers should know how to identify who has the first aid training. So they will be asked who is a first aider, and they should either know that person or know where to find that information. And the last question in section 11 asks, is there a means to transport an injured employee to a medical facility? So in the event of a medical emergency and where workers need to be transported to a facility, the employer must ensure that there's a safe and efficient means to do so. Employers need to take into account things like workers who are working alone, employees that are in remote areas, employees that are in difficult to access sites, or any specialized rescue needs that might be required. The big thing here with transporting workers after they've been injured is that under no circumstances should an injured worker ever transport themselves to a medical facility, regardless of how severe the injury is. And so just to summarize emergency preparedness with a few key points here, you must have emergency plans that are necessary for the work activities. Workers must be trained in your emergency response plan. Emergency plans should be tested at minimum annually. And employers must have a detailed fire plan and equipment. As well, you must have detailed first aid plan and equipment. So that rounds out the emergency preparedness section of the audit tool. We'll roll into the next section, which is records and statistics. So this is another big section. There's 8 questions here for a total of 18 possible points. So the first question here is there a process to organize and manage program documentation? So to meet the standard of this question, auditors are going to be looking for some system of organization. Your documents can be filed in cabinets, organized on computers, using third-party companies such as SiteDocs, archiving methods, whatever system you want to use, that's fine as long as you use some form of organization. What you don't want to do and what auditors will be looking for is, essentially handing them Rubbermaid totes of paperwork. Although in the past we have sorted through documents and papers like that, this question would result in a deficiency if that was your system of organization. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in the next slide. So there's some examples of how we see safety programs being organized. Now, this is not comprehensive. You don't have to have your system laid out like this, but if you have a system that works for you, don't change it. This is just how we see often how companies organize their documents. So some companies do it like by the work site, as you can see here. So if they had it, say, a hospital or a stadium site. Some companies do it by date range, so monthly or annual jobs. That's how they might organize their paperwork. Or some companies do it by the scope of the job. So perhaps they have residential, commercial, and industrial sites. So they organize it that way. But the only thing the auditors don't want, like I said in the previous slide, is that multitude of boxes and totes with paperwork thrown into them. Although in the past we have gone through them, this won't be the case for the foreseeable future because we are remotely auditing now and require everything to be available electronically. So we'll go into more on that on the next slide as well. So as Saskatchewan moves through that reopening plan, the SCSA has begun auditing again, but we're doing it remotely. So this means we won't be handling paper documents for the foreseeable future, and all audits will be done electronically. We have set up the file transfer protocol site that will be used during external audit processes. And each company who is having an external audit will receive login information for that site where they can upload all of their documents for review. And as well, this site is encrypted. So anything that you upload will only be available to you and the auditor. And once the audit is complete, all the information that's on that site will be deleted. So as you can see, this is our FTP layout, and it is laid out to mirror the audit tool. So it's organized to show documentation, policy, your company policies, PPE, or training and communication, anything like that. Now, depending on the size of your company and how much documentation you have, you may not have to upload everything to this site. But what will happen in those cases is the auditor will say, okay, we'd like you to send block samples and give you maybe a date range or a job site that they'd like to see. Whatever the case may be, they will be in touch with you in advance of the audit. So the next question asks, is our health and safety statistical reports generated on an ongoing or regular basis, and are they readily available? So CORE requires a few different statistical reports to meet the standard. We require both program documentation statistics, like the one you can see here. This form documents scheduled amount of program paperwork, and then the actual documents that were submitted. So this form can help you determine if there's a gap in your system. Maybe certain meetings aren't happening, orientations aren't being completed, whatever the case may be. The idea behind these records is to make sure that your program documentation is coming in at the standard that you've set in your policy. And if not, then develop corrective actions for that issue. The other type of statistics that CORE is asking for are the injury statistics. So these are records of any injury, whether it required medical attention or just first aid. With these numbers, you can calculate your company's injury frequency, which is how often your workers are getting hurt on average, and your injury severity. So this is how bad your injuries are based on the number of days that are lost because of that injury. So part of the audit tool does require that you're looking at both your paperwork statistics, are we meeting the standards we've set for ourselves, as well as you need to analyze that WCB data, right? So how often are we injuring our workers? How bad are those injuries? And then taking it one step further and saying, what are we going to do to resolve it? What are the corrective actions, and implementing it? So the next question asked, does the company compare health and safety performance year to year? So the auditor should find that the company is comparing their injury and documentation statistics yearly, and from that developing plans to improve the outcomes, either by changing the reporting structures or any other corrective actions that are going to help improve their program and injury outcomes. So as you can see in this chart here, this is actually an American statistic, but they're talking about injuries in the construction industry and how they've gone down since between 2003 and 2018. So we want to see something really similar for each company. By identifying what's happening and seeing those trends, that's how you correct those issues from getting worse. So the next section here says, are the annual statistics analyzed and needs or trends are identified? So the core standard requires that companies analyze the company's statistics and identify any gaps or needs that may be required. So you want to identify both positive and negative trends within the workplace through reporting. Brainstorm those solutions or brainstorm ideas and choose solutions to correct the trends and get them on a more positive outcome. Implement those changes and then of course follow up and make sure that they're effective, that they're working, that nothing needs to be changed or altered to make sure that it's successful. The next question here is, are adequate first aid treatment records kept? So legislative minimum requirements and core require that records of any first aids that occur on site be kept both for evidence of injury in case of a WCB claim, but also so that trends can be identified and appropriate controls are implemented. So in order to meet the standards of this question, first aid treatment records must be kept on an ongoing basis. Paper cut, stubbed toe, twisted ankle, doesn't matter what it is, you have to keep a record of the injury for both of those reasons. The auditor will be reviewing first aid report forms and first aid kit reports. So it depends, whichever way you have it, if you have forms that you want your workers to fill out, or if they just fill out the card that's inside the kit, the auditor is going to be looking for both. And when it comes down to it, if first aid supplies are being used, record must be kept. And if you've had an issue with that in the past where there are no records, then again, a corrective action might be implemented to get that reporting to start happening so you can figure out what's going on and why people are using those supplies, but maybe not documenting it. And the second to last question here of section 12 asks, was an action plan developed based on the most recent audit? So this question may not actually apply to you if this is your first external. But if it is your company's second or any subsequent audit, then this question will apply to you. So the auditor is looking to ensure that the corrective action plan was developed based on the previous audit, whether it was internal or external. You still have to submit a corrective action every year. The auditor should find specific details and steps that will be taken to correct previous deficiencies found in the audit. So this question only pertains to the development of the plan itself. So you have to have a plan in place. The last question of section 12 actually asks if that plan was communicated and implemented. So to expand on this last question, you have to communicate to everyone, and then you have to go one step further and implement that plan in a timely manner. The auditor is going to look for evidence that the last audit's results were effectively communicated to the workforce and that corrective actions were implemented promptly following the previous audit, right? So we do that by asking during the interview process, we ask workers what happened during the last audit. They should know what the deficiencies were and what the company was going to do to fix those. Now, this question I always view as sort of low-hanging fruit. What is identified as an issue previously, and did we inform the workers so that they understand that issue? And did we work with them to come up with effective solutions? During the interview phase, they're going to be asking them the results of that previous audit, so they should be able to answer those questions. And involving them in the process is part of core as well, right? It's not just about management doing core, it's about the entire company coming together to make sure that they're working safely. So just to sum up records and statistics, the companies must have a system to organize your program documentation and your statistics, okay? Boxes and Rubbermaid totes are not a system of organization. They must review the records and your stats annually and compare those year to year. Companies need to work towards identifying the needs and act acting upon those gaps in their safety program. You must keep record of any first aid treatments that happen. And previous corrective actions must be implemented and communicated to the workforce. Okay, and we'll go into our last section here. So legislation, as you can see, this is actually a very small section. There's only 4 questions. That being said, there is 12 points here. So the first part of this question asks, are copies of relevant legislation posted or made available at each workplace? So every employer has a duty and a responsibility to make relevant legislation available to their workers, whether it might be relevant provincial legislation, such as the OH&S regulations, labor standards laws, like the Saskatchewan Employment Act, or in federally regulated workplaces and industries, the Canada Labor Code. Regardless, you must have any relevant legislation or pieces of legislation available for workers to review. And this is both an observation and an interview question. So for the observations, the auditor is going to look and see that, are they made available? And during the interview, workers should be able to describe where they can find that information. The second question of legislation asks is, does the management and supervisor regularly refer to relevant legislation and regulations during job planning? So the core standards include a requirement for management to regularly refer to relevant legislation and standards during the job planning. So it's imperative to the success of the company's health and safety program that management's commitment rather is displayed through the understanding of these laws and standards which guide their actions. And this question is an interview only question. So workers must be able to describe at least one time their manager or supervisor referred to legislation during the job planning process. Now 13.3 asks, are personnel aware of their rights and responsibilities and how to exercise them? So the first thing I want to ask are, what are the 3 rights? So the first one is the right to know. So you have the right to know about the hazards and how to protect yourself. The second one is the right to participate. So that's participating in your workplace OH&S, anything to do with health and safety, training, or your committee. And then the final one is the right to refuse. So you have the right to refuse anything, any unusually dangerous work is how it's defined. Now, these are interview only questions. And so workers and managers will be asked if they know what these rights are, and they'll be expected to know all 3 of the rights as well as what they mean in the context of their work. Now, the last question of section 13 asks, does the employer's accident reporting meet the legislated criteria? So this question is asking specifically about reporting what's called a dangerous occurrence. So a dangerous occurrence is a specific type of incident that must be reported to OH&S if they occur. So these incidents include things like the structural failure or collapse of things like scaffold, false work, formwork, shafts, tunnels, cofferdams, trenches, or excavations. As well, the failure or overturning of any cranes or units of powered mobile equipment. If workers contact an energized electrical conductor, the bursting of a grinding wheel is considered a dangerous occurrence. It goes on to say the uncontrolled spill or escape of a toxic, corrosive, or explosive substance. The premature or accidental detonation of explosives. Failure of an elevated or suspended platform, as well as the failure of an atmosphere supplying respirator. So with these questions, what the auditor will determine is, what does your policy say on handling incidents that, like I've listed here, and what you have done in the past regarding incidents of this nature if they have occurred on your sites. Your company policy should state what you will do if they happen, and your incident reports should back up that your company followed the legislative reporting criteria. Oftentimes, the reason companies have a deficiency in this question is that they've had one of the above listed incidents occur. They've completed the necessary paperwork, forms, incident reports, and investigations, but then never took that additional step of reporting the incident to OH&S. So again, going through your incidents, going through your reports, making sure that you're doing what's required of you as far as the legislation lays out. And just to summarize legislation, so a few key points. You have to ensure that there are relevant copies of legislation available to your workforce at all times. Management and supervisors should know the legislation that applies to them and be referring to it regularly. Workers need to know their rights. And accident reporting criteria, such as that for dangerous occurrences, must meet the minimum standard. So throughout the company's progress through your core certification, we just like to touch base again and say that advisory services is here to help you work towards a successful audit. So we can work with companies in developing their safety manual or redeveloping policies that might need to be edited. We develop forms for companies. We can do training needs analysis, program implementation. So if this is your first time with anything, we can help you with that. Pre-audit checks. So if you have an audit coming up and you don't have an advisor already working with you, we can send one in to do a pre-audit check and make sure that everything's going to go well and you have everything that's necessary. And as well, advisory services is helping with the remote audit and FTP site assistance with companies. So if you have any issues with those as well, that's what we're here for. And that sums up sections 11 to 13 of the audit tool. I will figure out how to turn my screen off.
Well, thanks, Laura. That was really good. So quite informative. Again, like she said, the advisors are here to help for any specific questions you have. That was a great overview. Again, we have the documentation organization, the audit build-ups. Before that, all on YouTube, so you can break it down by section if you got anything specific, and you're always free to email or call us. Next Thursday, we'll be finishing up the remainder of the audit tool. We're almost there. So just our supplementary and optional sections at the end of the book. Without further ado then, I'm sure everyone's got some questions here, so let's start to look. As an electrical company, do I need anything specific regarding emergency planning?
I would say yes. Every company, depending on the work that they do, should have work-specific, task-specific emergency preparedness plans. You should have something for electrocution, accidental electrocution if you're an electrical company, drowning if you're working near water, etc. So not just the fire plan or the evacuation plan, but we want to make sure that we're keeping the worker safe regardless of the tasks that they're performing.
Legislation also does say that electricians have to have, I forget what it's called specifically, but they do have to have procedures for electrical shock and rescue of that person.
Yeah, I believe that's right too, Kieran, that you got to remember that a lot of times with electrical, they could still actually be being electrocuted. So the danger persists. So it's like it's a high risk rescue like H2S and other stuff where you actually need to be a little more trained than just having a procedure. And that needs to be written by a trained person. Next, can one of my supervisors inspect our fire extinguisher monthly? Do they need specific training? Who should do the annual inspection?
I would say yes, supervisors can do that as part of the routine inspection as well. I don't know of any specific training, but there is fire extinguisher training you can get. Annual inspections should be done by a qualified outfit place, so they'll come and they'll service the fire extinguisher.
Okay, next question here. Do I have to compare my first aid kit to the legislation? Should they not already have everything already? I just bought mine 2 months ago from a safety supply store.
So, I mean, generally speaking, they should, have everything, but it depends on what you're doing for work, where your sites are. And so if you really want to be sure that you're meeting the standard, just looking through those tables, 9, 10, 11, and 12, it'll tell you what exactly has to be in there, down to like you need to have 2 4x4 gauze pads kind of thing. So I would compare it just to be sure, because, you know, the safety suppliers, I mean, or the manufacturers of those kits, you know, if they're in the States, they're not necessarily following what our legislation says. So the best thing to do is just to confirm that information, and don't be too overwhelmed by the tables, because they're only, you know, half a page each. So it's not like a ton of information and lists you need to go through to find that. It's a pretty basic list of first aid supplies that you need to have.
Yeah, and you know, just you know, being in Saskatchewan here, there's a lot of remote locations. So the farther you are away from a medical facility, all that stuff, like it all increases what needs to be in. So, and every first aid kit is different, like Laura was saying, right? You buy one just for your family needs, or, you know, you're buying one to put in your company truck, or have way out in the wilderness when you're working out there. It's all going to be different, and some of them aren't even all in the kit. You're going to need a stretcher to go with that, an emergency plan on how you're going to get this guy to the hospital that's 500 kilometers away, right? Like, so yeah, just by buying one, it's not stocked up. Definitely look at your legislation, and then have extra, because I mean, as soon as you use it, you no longer have what's required. So, you know, it doesn't hurt to have extra on hand. Next question: is it good to have an extra person trained in first aid?
Extra training is always good. Yeah, even if for the size of your company, you're only supposed to have 1 first aid trained personnel. If something happens to that person, who's then going to be their rescuer, kind of thing. So you want to make sure that you're covered on all aspects. Or if they're on holidays or they have a sick day, they don't show up, then you have nobody that's trained on site. So yes, it's always a good idea to have extra personnel trained in first aid.
Okay, great answer. Hard to add to that one. When it comes to stats, what if I have no injuries? Do I still need to fill out the forms?
Yes, you do. That's really great if you don't have any injuries, but you still fill out the forms, and that would put your frequency and severity at 0. Yeah, you still need to obviously identify that it's at 0, that those things aren't happening, and then you can compare that data, even though it's 0 year to year, right?
Yeah, it also just reminds yourself that you're doing them, right? It gets you in that habit of once a month checking, or, you know, going to the first aid kit and grabbing that piece of paper and then just seeing. So it's just a habit to develop. It doesn't take long to put it in the book. Everyone's got to be happy writing zeros down, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and then the other thing that comes up too, and like I'd mentioned in there, is that, you know, if supplies are being used, then there should be documentation for those injuries, right? And so that's kind of, you know, when I was working in the field, you know, we had no injuries, nobody was getting injured, but for some reason, all my first aid kits were just totally stripped of every Band-Aid and gauze that there was in there. So obviously there was injuries happening and people weren't telling me about it, right? So then you have to come up with a system, right? Like, what are we going to do? Because obviously people are getting hurt and they're just not filling out that form. So it's a good way to keep track of that kind of stuff, right? And doing those inventories and talking to your guys.
That's a good lead up to my next question here, Laura, because it's in regards to the supply list. It's I keep my Band-Aids outside of my first aid kit, because I'm tired of the guys rooting through the whole first aid kit to get a Band-Aid. Do I have to record minor cuts and bruises from that stock?
Yes, you do. Any injury that happens at work, whether it's paper cut or crush somebody's finger or they lost an arm, you want to report it, right? You want to have documented evidence of that injury. Safety people have all heard like horror stories of somebody getting a paper cut and then losing their hand because of it, and not having reported it and being SOL for getting compensation, right? So you have to report it, whether it's a small one or a big one. And if that's the way you're doing it, where you keep your band-aids sort of separate, so the guys have to come to you and let you know what's going on, then that might be how you do it, right? To keep track of that if the guys aren't self-reporting.
No, that's exactly right. If you document it, you don't know what's down the road, right? Like something can seem minor, and they didn't get tetanus shot, or they got an infection or anything, right? You just mark it down. It's really easy to do. Keep that form near your first aid kit to help you do that. Should be good. All right, next question. I have my baseline audit this fall. I only need to provide 6 months of documentation. How do I compare year-to-year statistics? And actually, I got another one in regards to that. Well, we'll do kind of a 2 questions here at once, because there's another one in regards to, I analyze monthly. Do I need to do yearly? So it's kind of all in the same sort of thing here.
Okay, can you read the first question again, Steve? Sorry.
I have my baseline audit this fall. I only need to provide 6 months of documentation. How do I compare year-to-year stats?
Right. Okay. So for a baseline audit, there are going to be a few questions that are going to be not applicable. So the auditor will edit the final scores depending on the not applicable question. So does the company compare year-to-year safety stats? That's going to be a non-applicable for a baseline audit. Same with the corrective action plan. Was the previous corrective action plan communicated to the workers and implemented? You don't have one from last time because this is your first audit, so that's going to be an NA question.
Okay, great. And then just to add then to that, to the monthly, then if you do, if you analyze your trends monthly, do you have to do it yearly?
It's a good idea to get an idea of, like monthly you want to see where you're at, and then at the end of the year you want to go through and say, okay, did we have way more hand injuries in July than any other month? If so, what was the cause of that? That's the way that you can identify those needs and trends.
No, that's a great answer. And then, looking down at the end of the year, I'm a fan of numbers. So when you look at numbers, they usually don't lie. There's usually something you can pick out of there to fix things. So doing on the monthly, that's great. But at the end of the year, like Kara said, like just because something happened in July, why didn't it happen in October? Most likely they were wearing gloves one time, but not the other. It could have been something that simple, right? So,
and I think it's just like best practice to do it a year to year, right? So you want to have your 2018, your 2019, your 2020 stats, right? And have your overall big picture of the year, right? And then having that detailed month to month information is great, because I know a lot of companies don't do that or go that far. But year to year, I think it's better to have your big picture, as opposed to just saying, well, July of 2018 was better than April of 2020. You know what I mean? Like if you're just doing it month to month.
no. Oh, great. Do I need, so this one's kind of along the same lines here. Do I need to record every Band-Aid? I have some missing, but don't know when and who needed it. How do I encourage my employees to report incidences? So I guess this goes beyond just recording it. Is how do I make sure that every time I look in the kit, something's missing, right? How do I get that figured out?
I think that's a really great question. Says he wants to change his culture and get his guys to start doing that stuff, right? So there's lots of different ways. I mean, just reminding them that, they won't be punished or just acted negatively against for reporting injuries. I know in my experience and a lot of people's experience, people were encouraged not to report because that negatively affected the company. So if you let your employees know that you're comfortable with that you want them to come to you, that's what that is there for, that insurance, is that if you get hurt at work, you're covered. And so just letting them know that you sort of have an open door policy, that you're willing to do that, and that's important for you. you're showing them that you're willing to do that, and that you're positive in that aspect.
No, agreed. It's advantageous for both parties to want to report, right? I mean, that carries on down the road, and that's costly in time and money on both ends. So to report and to encourage that reporting and have that culture where you can say, yeah, just let me know. Like, here's your Band-Aid. Let's check you out. Make sure that it's not as bad like you saying it is, right? Because some people underreport. They're worried that they're, you know, maybe there was a safe job procedure this morning that they didn't pay attention to, that they feel like they're going to get into trouble in the afternoon. But no, get it reported. Don't make people feel bad about it. And yeah, that'll really help both the worker and the company. All right, next question. Do I need to have a paper copy of the legislation, or is a downloaded PDF accessible? Where can I get a paper copy? I'm old school and I prefer the book.
We are the same then. I personally love having paper copies of everything. So you can go to the Queen's printer online and order a copy. You can download from there as well PDF versions of the legislation. The only thing that I would remind people about that is that one, if you're in the middle of nowhere and you're having an audit, and do the workers have access to the ledge? Well, if they have no internet access and they can't download it, and they haven't downloaded it in advance, then that would be a no. So just make sure that they actually have a physical downloaded copy. It's not just like an internet access. And then as well, with the downloadable copies, they've separated the documents. So you have to have a copy of the Act, the regulations, and they've separated the WMIS regulations as well into its own separate document. So it's not just about having the one, you have to have all of them.
No, that's great. And then as you say separating, it made me chuckle because I was actually online using it. I'm a book guy too. I got the book in front of me. Sometimes though, that electric or like the electronic version can come in pretty handy for searching. Kara was actually the one that pointed out how you can just find the Explorer on there, type in training, and anything to do with training is going to come up. So if you're looking for something specific, it's a great way to do it, because actually funnily enough, the index isn't downloadable like everything is. It's a lot harder to come by, but I think it's because of how easy it is to actually search that way. Yeah, so for those of you that need the old copy, like, yeah, they're great to have handy. I like to open it up because, like you said, an emergency situation when things power down or your phone's not working, you have access to something that you're supposed to always have access to. So but yeah, that electronic copy is, they're great for finding stuff pretty fast.
Yeah, and I was just going to say too, if you don't already have a copy of our the SCSA Guide to Legislation app, that's a really good one to have just for ease of use. If you're not really great with legislation anchors that they put out, you can search by keyword on our app and it brings up the relevant legislation. So it's a little easier to sift through the information.
All right, next question. So how do I train my workers in dangerous occurrences? Is there something I can download and review at a meeting?
The dangerous occurrences, as Laura showed in her presentation, are actually in the legislation. So you can find that section, photocopy it if you want to have a handout for the workers, and then review that at your safety meeting for sure.
I think we have a Toolbox Talk on it as well, if I'm not mistaken. So that's on our website under Toolbox Talks. You can go there and find just some point form information on what it is and how to go about reporting it.
Yeah, and our Toolbox Talks are now alphabetical order too, so it makes it a lot easier to find. The old format was by year. Now you just go to D, look for dangerous occurrences, and it'll be there if we do in fact have one.
I'll put a link in the chat, Steve. I found it.
Awesome.
But I do like that question. Is there something I can download and review at a meeting? The fact that you're having toolbox talks and you're referring to stuff like that, those are great training tools, right? It doesn't always have to be job practices and procedures. Like that's another part of your safety program, and just to add something new in there. You know, like Laura was bringing up emergency preparedness earlier. People, I don't think, plan enough for stuff that's might not happen, but that's why it's an emergency, right? So next question. How do I report an incident to OHS? What is required?
So as far as I understand, like reporting a dangerous occurrence to OH&S, they have a phone number that's listed on Google. You just call into them and ask to speak to an officer on duty, and they'll put you through, and you just talk to the officer and to explain to them what happened. With involving the officers and the reporting procedures and the legislation, the key really is for the officers is that they're going to be just following up with you to make sure that you're doing enough to make sure it doesn't happen again. Right? So they review your investigation report, they review the incident report, and just, you know, really, they're like a second set of eyes on that, right? To make sure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Yeah, and you know, if your supervisors are taking like the Leadership for Safety Excellence course, it talks about investigations and stuff like that. So yeah, like Laura said, your OH&S just wants to make sure that you're doing it. I mean, if it's really big, they're obviously going to come out, but the more you can have prepared for them, I mean, you're not going to want to make them the absolute first call. You want to make sure everybody's safe, that sort of stuff. But yeah, make sure you report to them, and then start following your investigation protocol that you learn in LSE or your OHC level 2. Next, I need WMIS training for core. Do we have an update when the course will be available? Well, we don't have any trainers in here today, so I think they're out working really hard on it. This is a question that gets brought up lots. It is coming. Like, it's definitely something that that we're all well aware that people want and need, whether it's NCSO or core. It's getting close, but we can't give you any hard updates at this time. That'll be coming out of program services. And you know, I've told the members that have called me is, you know, I got you on a waiting list. Get yourself on that waiting list with program services, because they'll fire out an email to anybody on that waiting list as soon as it's open. So I invite you to get your name on that or your email on that list. All right, so how do I easily reference ledge at a toolbox? Do I need to document all the ledge that I quote word for word?
That's a really good question. So as at a toolbox talk, really it's, I mean, whatever you attach to that toolbox talk document, right? So, so when we have a safety meeting internally, you know, we have our document that we fill out. Okay, this is what we talked about, and then we attach maybe a copy of the toolbox talk if that's what we used, or we attach a copy of the legislation that we reviewed. If you don't want to do that, then I mean, simply commenting in there that, you know, I reviewed dangerous occurrences with the guys today. We talked about, you know, the fact that there was maybe the structural collapse of one of our scaffolds and how that qualified as a dangerous occurrence. So, you know, it's just, you don't have to sit there and write out legislation. Like, that would be so monotonous, and I would not wish that on my worst enemy. But you just documenting what it is you talked about, try and be as specific as possible. And then, you know, if it's easier for you, just attach the documents and document, you know, see attached legislation review or see attached toolbox talk from the SCSA, whatever that case may be.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, you don't have to, like, if you want to start citing ledge, you can go down a rabbit hole for a lot of different things down one avenue. So just kind of, you basically want to let guys know that it's there, where they can find it. So, I mean, even, you know, your safe job procedure has reference to ledge at the bottom and where you can find that specific thing on there. So another good opportunity is whenever you're doing anything like that, just, you know, it doesn't have to be everything that's written in Ledge, but just a reference of where to find it better for sure. So thanks, Laura. All right. I would like to have my baseline audit this fall. While we are still busy, will auditors be coming out this fall, or should I start preparing for the remote audit stuff? FTP stuff, question mark. Can I call and book now?
You can definitely call the office and book an audit right now. As far, last time I was informed, we didn't have a date for when the auditors were going to be back on site. So right now we are just doing remote audits, both C-Corps and Corps.
Okay, no, great answer. Okay, we're gonna just get, looks like we're getting close out of time here. Is the SCSA app fulfill my need for workers to have access to legislation?
No, it doesn't have all of the legislation pertinent to the jobs you may be doing, so it's definitely best to use the internet or download the file for the PDF that's on the web, if not actually having a physical copy on site.
Yeah, that's right. Like that, the app is a great tool for quick reference to many things, but it's not all encompassing to what it's kind of the Coles Notes version of the whole Ledge. So you're going to want to make sure that the entire document is accessible to everybody. So it goes into more depth, not just the overview.
Yeah.
All right, we got time for one more question, and then I think we're gonna have to say farewell here. So fire seems to be the main emergency in the audit tool. Do I need to have any more plans?
Yes. So the minimum is fire and first aid, right? Like you should have that because that really kind of could apply to anybody, right? And then depending on what you're doing for work, you might need to have other ones. So we talked about, you know, earthquakes, tsunamis, extreme weather, intruders or active shooters. I've had companies that have wild animal emergencies because they work in the bush, you know, so it really depends on the line of work that you have. But you don't want to just be stuck with a fire and first aid, right? Like think outside the box, have a brainstorming session, you know, what could go wrong here? And what are we going to do to make sure that everything is okay if that were to happen?
Yeah, you know, like for me, like I have the weather app on my phone, so there's a potential for a warning or a watch every single day. So like to have beyond fire, like, you know, I've definitely seen more opportunities where like wind, thunder, hail, lightning is going to be more of a danger than fire itself. So you want to be thinking about that stuff. You know, where are you located? What are you in? Like if it's an H2S sort of rescue, and they talked before about the electrical ones, you're going to want definitely emergency plans. And an emergency is something that can potentially happen where you are, but just, you know, if you're doing everything right, it won't happen, but you want to be prepared when it does. So you don't want your guys panicking. You want them getting out safely. You want everybody to know their task when that time comes, because if nobody knows, you hit the panic button and it's not getting handled properly. So yeah, just do those drills once a month, you know, just remind the guys what their specific tasks are, right? You're not running outside in a tornado, right? That's the fire. You know, just make sure everybody's on the same board. Who's calling, right? Who's making sure, counting heads, and who's calling 911, right? You don't want to bombard 911 with 10 people calling. So yeah, just, oh, I heard a bing. So I'm starting to ramble on there. I guess somebody giving me the hook. All right. Anyway, thanks, team. That was a great presentation, Laura. Next Tuesday, like we said, we're going to finish the audit section, and this Thursday will be a great session on concrete, I believe. So our last Thursday was painting. It was a great one. Make sure you tune in for the Thursday one as well. All right, take care, everybody.